well, if you had an IPP, how much more could you have put away into this plan? And they'll do the math and say, this is the differential, this is the delta. So we're allowed to create the contribution room to have you take advantage of it right away. So depending on the age and the history, this could be anywhere from $1,000 to multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the client details.
Hi, and welcome to the Millennial Money Canada podcast. I'm your host, Guillaume, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If you're a new listener, welcome. Our goal is to help you elevate your knowledge about finance so that you can live well, build wealth, give generously, and leave a legacy that you're proud of. This episode is for incorporated business owners who want to increase their retirement savings beyond the RRSP deduction limit by creating an individual pension plan within the corporation. I will cover what is an individual pension plan, what are the advantages and the disadvantages, the cost, who is it suited for, how to set it up, how to decumulate it once you reach retirement, but also what to consider before implementing this type of solution, which is not for everyone. So my guest today is Tatenda. He holds a Bachelor of Actuarial Science from the University of Calgary. He spent the last decade at GBL in various roles and now manages client relationships and business development and work with people like myself and our clients. And just a little bit about GBL. So it was founded in 1995, and they bring a unique expertise to small business owners and incorporated professionals to help them solve tax and retirement planning challenges. And one of the solutions that they provide, or at least that we cover today, is the individual pension plan. There is also another solution called the Retirement Compensation Arrangement, RCAs, which we didn't have time to cover today, but perhaps we'll do it in a future episode. With that being said, let's go to the episode, and I hope you enjoy. Tatenda Mawoyo, welcome to the Millennial Money Canada podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Can you share your story that led you to following a path in or studying actuarial science and then growing your career at a company called GBL?
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure if this has happened before on your podcast, but we have two people with accents on here, so people might be picking up on that from me. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. It's kind of where I was born and went to school. And towards the tail end of my, high schooling, I was sort of looking into different options of what to do. I kind of had a technical leaning, so I was looking at things like engineering, software development. And then I had a friend of mine who just told me, hey, you should really look into this actuarial science thing. It might be something, given your skill set, you might be really interested in doing. So lo and behold, I looked into it. It was such that in my home country of Zimbabwe at the time, the programs maybe weren't as good as maybe I'd hoped for. So I applied to universities all over the world. And it just so happened that, I got accepted into the University of Calgary, which is what brought me all the way from Zimbabwe to Canada. So that was fun experience in minus 40 degree weather, but I'm still here. So did that in the schooling. Was kind of going through the degree program, writing my exams along the way. And I was fortunate enough to get an internship at GBL. This is going back to 2012. And after that, I stayed on full time. So I was really working towards being an actuary, working in the actuarial department, first as a junior analyst, then as an analyst, and then as a senior analyst. So it was a fantastic place to work. I was learning, really going deep into the actuarial world and learning a lot of that. Throughout the course of my career, I started to, I guess like many people, just maybe have different desires or different things I wanted to achieve with my sort of career in terms of the tail end. And I just made a decision that, being an actuary exclusively maybe wasn't quite for me. Even though I was quite far along in my education and writing exams, I found myself being very interested in I saw what the business development people were doing in our company and the client relations people. I was very interested in financial planning and sort of the intersection between that and the actuarial world. So this was about 2019. I actually left GBL at the time to sort of go find my way and really figure out what I wanted to do. And then a few years later, this is in 2022, an opportunity opened up for me to come back to GBL. And it was again to be more in this client-facing or client-focused role, where I do a lot of education, building awareness, helping people really explore what it is that GBL does and helping people if it makes sense to implement it. So obviously I benefit greatly from all the nerdy and technical stuff that I've gotten into and learned over the years. But at the same time, I love being able to help people sort of lean on my expertise and help them to understand what these strategies are and how they work and really help them make a good decision for themselves. So it's been great ever since.
Wow. Yeah, we'll definitely get into the details and the intricacies of the services and the topic of this episode around the individual pension plan in a minute. But before, I just want to go back at your first point when we introduced it, when you started the podcast. Yeah. What was the best part of growing up in Zimbabwe?
That's a good, I mean, the things I really kind of benefited from is, you know, in a way that's home at the time. So that's why I have a lot of family and extended family and whatnot. But you know what, I probably say one thing I benefited the most from Zimbabwe was just, you kind of learn how to persevere, grow up in an environment like that. I mean, when I was born in Zimbabwe at the time, it was nicknamed the breadbasket of Africa, right? It was such a prosperous place. And unfortunately, by the time I left, I remember coming to university and going to all the economics classes. And when they talk about countries with very high inflation and sort of poor economics, it was sort of awkward being in the class and they use Zimbabwe as an example. But when you live life through that, you kind of learn how to, how to persevere, have to work hard, be resourceful, entrepreneurial. So I wish I had gone that way, but those are some things that you definitely learn along the way that just help you, I guess, in your personal development. Yeah.
How did you find adapting to like a country like Canada and migrating here like full time and staying here?
Right. Yeah. So it was definitely, not the least nerve-wracking thing I've ever done in my life. You're leaving the place that you call home and going to a country where literally I knew nobody. But I guess what I'd say in summary is, in terms of Canada and the culture and the people, it's super welcoming, super friendly, super kind. I vividly remember, I kind of got to university, I packed my bags and I made my first friends within literally the first 5 minutes, right? And we still keep in touch until this day. So it was a very accommodating culture I found. And, I kind of had to force myself to be outgoing and kind of embrace the new and the unknown. So I'd say it, being here, having a lot of people, I guess at the same time, were immigrating along with me as well. So it wasn't that I was alone, I should say, I guess. So yeah, no, it was really, for the most part, smooth sailing.
Wow. Oh, that's a cool story. I mean, yeah, today we definitely want to focus more like on GBL, but I think your story is very inspiring. Yeah, I'm super happy to, have you on the podcast and pick your brain and your expertise over the last, like you mentioned, decade or so, working with various people who are using your services. So can you talk about what is GBL's kind of overarching mission and what are the primary services that you guys offer to incorporated business owners?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say particularly when it comes to business owners or incorporated professionals, what our mission is across the entire country, we want to make it as accessible as possible for people to take advantage of the specialized solutions we have in the areas of retirement planning and tax planning. The things we dabble in are kind of more niche, more specialized. In bygone years, or things that are really sort of more taken advantage of by larger corporations, the ultra wealthy, for example. But what we want to do is we want to make them accessible to, small and medium-sized corporations and business owners as well. And some of the really key things we do to make that happen is, as we'll kind of get into it, with a lot of these solutions we dabble in, such as individual pension plans, that typically involves money being invested and grown with certain advantages along the way. So at GBL, we're not involved in asset management at all, right? So we don't charge anything based on the assets that are being employed in these solutions. And I think what that does is clients aren't having to start a new investment management relationship or a new accounting relationship. So we're independent. So it's, as a business owner, you keep working with who you like to work with, and we're brought alongside your existing team just to specifically offer our expertise to make sure that you can take advantage of this in a way that makes sense. So something else we do that's really sort of feeding our mission, I'd say, is with everything we do, we want to have a full service approach, right? So when we're not consulting a business owner on why this makes sense and then leaving it up to you to figure it out, is we help with the implementation of these strategies and solutions. We also help with the administration and the compliance work while you're taking advantage of these solutions as well. And so those are the things we do. We've invested a lot in our processes and people and systems, to make this thing streamlined and cost effective so that as many people as possible can take advantage of it at the end of the day. And to touch on your last point in terms of what are these services, I know we'll get into many of them later on, but it's things like individual pension plans, retirement compensation arrangements, which are more sort of geared towards retirement planning. Other things we do, things like setting up health benefit plans, which is a way for business owners to turn out-of-pocket medical expenses into a pre-corporate tax benefit. And so we help with making these things accessible, streamlined, and easy to take advantage of.
What is an individual pension plan?
That's a great question. So if I were talking to a business owner and a corporate professional, in response to that, I'd say an individual pension plan is a defined benefit pension plan that you can establish for yourself. Now, I know there's probably something I've said in there that might need some explanation, which is what is a defined benefit pension plan? So maybe I can explain that briefly. So when it comes to the world of pension plans, you can sort of maybe put them in two categories. You have a type of pension plan that's called a defined contribution pension plan. You can think of this as being something like, it's essentially like an RRSP that's wrapped up in a pension plan. And it's defined contribution being that what's defined or what's set is how much you can put into it, right? For an RRSP, it's your 18% of your salary. You put that into an account that's invested. And then in terms of your retirement, what you have is sort of what you've accumulated over the years. It is there to fund your retirement for as long as the assets last. Defined benefit pension plan works a different way. We see this a lot, for example, for teachers, for example. A lot of them would have a defined benefit pension plan. And what that is the employer has made a promise saying, when you retire, we're going to give you X amount per year or X amount per month throughout your lifetime. And then the employer takes care of making sure that there's enough assets to fund that benefit. And so that's how an IPP is structured. It's a business owner who's saying, I'm going to use my corporation, which is my employer, to set up this defined benefit pension plan for myself. I'm going to promise myself X amount per year or X amount per month to be paid to me in the future. And then I'm going to use my corporation to fund this pension plan for myself. The only thing I'd add to clarify to that is, unlike somebody like a teacher where, there's this pension plan that's set up, but in terms of the contributions and the investments, that sort of happens behind the curtain. For a business owner, they're using their own corporation, right? So it's self-funded and self-directed. So it's a business owner using their own corporation or business to fund this pension plan. And it's also self-directed in terms of they work with their, let's say, investment manager to manage the assets, right? It's not somebody else who's taking that away from them. And I'm sure we'll get into more details following that, but in a nutshell, that's kind of how I'd present it.
That great explanation. So to summarize what you said, people who are employed and have this golden retirement plan, which used to be called that way, I think, for whoever had like a defined benefit retirement plan, where when they retire, they get a specific amount that is, usually adjusted for inflation, depending on their salary and their past years of service. But then here, if you're an incorporated business owner in Canada, you have the ability to create that for yourself using your corporation. And like you mentioned, I think this is a great point where it's self-directed and also self-funded, which is a little bit different than, let's say, if you were an employee where things are happening a bit more behind the scene. The company, who you work for has the ownership of meeting the future obligations. But now when you set up for yourself within your corporation, we'll get into the detail of like the intricacies of it, but yeah, essentially there's more management there, which makes sense because it's your own corporation as well. So, but that's why you would seek out an expert like yourself, like myself, to manage the amount that would be within the IPP in order to implement this successfully, essentially.
Exactly.
So who is the individual pension plan best suited for?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, oftentimes when I get this question, it's presented to me in terms of, maybe what types of professions or industries does this make sense to take advantage of? And I say in our experience, we don't really see the trend, I guess, broken up in that way. It's similar to an RSP, where I wouldn't say an RSP works better for somebody in this type of profession or this type of industry versus another, where it really comes down to the particulars of the individual. So what we see in terms of being somebody who qualifies or should maybe look into an IPP for themselves, maybe four things we take a look at. Number one is, for the individual, we're looking for somebody who is, the term is a connected person or a connected employee. So there's an individual who owns at least 10% of the corporation that's going to set up this IPP. right? So you're looking at a lot of incorporated professionals, a lot of owner managers, maybe minority partners who own at least that 10%. We'll certainly get into more details in terms of why that's the case, but it comes down to the fact that when you do an IPP for this individual, the rules that are associated with it are very flexible, right? It's not going to act like a traditional defined benefit pension plan where there's a lot of regulation and funding rules enforced. So we really are looking for sort of that incorporated professional or owner manager who owns at least 10%. Number two is once you have this individual, you're looking at somebody who pays themselves a salary from their corporation, similar to an RSP where somebody pays themselves a salary and then that salary is what creates the contribution room in an RSP. It's the same sort of mechanics in an IPP as well, where you're going to have this owner manager or this professional with a corporation. They pay themselves from a salary from their business or their corp, and then that salary then creates the contribution room to take advantage of in the IPP. Unfortunately, we can't use dividend income. Same thing for an RSP. So you're looking for somebody who takes a salary as well. The third thing I'd say is age does come into play as well in terms of who you're looking at, who can be suited for an IPP. I'm not going to get nerdy into the math, as I certainly can, but it just so happens that when you do the math on an IPP, it just so happens that if somebody's below the age of, let's say, between 38 and 40, they actually get more contribution room, or I suppose a better tax benefit by utilizing their RSP for the most part compared to an IPP. Once somebody starts to be older than 40, that's where you start to see the contribution room in an IPP start to overtake or surpass an RSP. And then really that's typically at the earliest when it makes sense to say, hey, does it make sense for me to, going forward, stop using an RSP and set up an IPP for myself instead? Because now I'm going to start creating additional contribution for myself above and beyond what I'd have if I just stuck with an RSP going forward.
So let's say you have someone who is 30 years old today.
Okay.
In order to max out their RSP contribution or past years to create that contribution up, up 18% up to 2025 is going to be 32,490, I believe. So if they wanted to max this, then they would technically need to earn, around $180,500, give and take. So if you have a 30-year-old individual right now who's making, or, perhaps is making, 250,000, but they're paying themselves T4 salaries of 180, then they're creating themselves like the maximum RSP room possible. What you're saying is because they're 30, that room, the 32,000 is better or higher, within an RRSP than if they implemented an IPP at that specific age. But then as they get to the age of 40, 38 to 40, the crossover, this is where the IPP, they will be able to put more money into an IPP than they would otherwise be in an RSP.
That's correct, exactly.
Can you talk about, at a high level, like why is that and what are the factors that are influencing that contribution room, where it makes it, or where the IPP looks less advantageous in their earlier years?
Right, for sure, definitely. So when it comes to, just like you say, for something like an RSP, regardless of how old somebody is, whether they are 18 years old or 66, right, it's the same formula used for an RSP. Is you're going to be able to put in 18% of your salary. Now, obviously, the 18% was set up or determined, a long time ago, and it's I suppose it's more of an average over a lifetime that they've set that at. But when it comes to an individual pension plan specifically, part of what GBL does, or why GBL needs to be involved, is there's a type of professional called an actuary that needs to be involved. And what this actually does is they determine what contribution is required at each age. So they're actually required to do the math to legitimize what can be put into a plan. And when they actually does the math, they factor in, well, what current age are you at? They factor in mortality, average life expectancy. And the reason you sort of see in some years an IPP being lower than an RSP is, as part of their math, is they're trying to take a look, well, how far away are you from retirement and how much do you need to put in today? So you can imagine if somebody is age 62, they are very close to their retirement year. So if they want to fund a particular benefit, because they don't have as much, an investment time horizon, they're going to need to put in more on the front end because they're not going to be able to invest and grow their money over as long a period of time as somebody, let's say, who's 30. right? If somebody is 30 years old, but they've got a 35-year runway until they get to 65, well, the way the math is going to work out is we're going to say, if you want to find a particular benefit at age 65, you have such a long investment time horizon that you don't need to put in as much today. So compared to somebody who's older, you can get away with putting in a lower contribution amount because you're going to be able to invest and compound that over a longer period of time. So that's why for the younger years, you see the contribution room being lower, and then it sort of ratchets up as somebody gets older and closer to the retirement years.
And the amount that you want to stipulate to have at retirement, can you talk about how this is determined?
So there's a formula that's used, and it's the provisions are right in the Income Tax Act. So it's nothing GBL is making up. The sort of maximums that we have to follow. And so I suppose one thing I'd say from the get-go is because the business owner is doing this for themselves, right? I like to say it's their business, it's their retirement, it's their money. So they can really choose to maximize this or the potential benefit of this IPP as much as possible. And so the most that we can do that's allowed by the Act is it's called a 2% rule. So it is essentially how the math works to determine what's going to be paid in retirement is for each year, we take a look at how much salary this business owner paid themselves from their corporation. Like you mentioned earlier on, we cap it at the maximum that's applicable for that year. You mentioned early on, but we're currently at about that $180,000 limit to maximize this retirement benefits. And then we take 2% of that. So for each year where they salary themselves, we take 2% of each year's salary. And then we add all those 2%, I suppose. We add up the 2% of each year. And the total of that is the pension that's going to be payable come the retirement years.
Okay. And if someone, for example, paid themselves dividends for whatever reason, maybe they were working with an accountant that were telling them that, hey, CPP is not worth it, various reasons, you would, may potentially be better off by paying yourself dividend. But suddenly they realize or they would want to explore a solution like the IPP. How is the switch occurring and what are the factors to consider there?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, in my profession, it's something I come across very regularly where we have a lot of clients who historically they have paid themselves dividends. Like I mentioned earlier on, we unfortunately, we can't use dividends to create these benefits in the IPP. And so a lot of people would consider doing that switch to say, maybe let me overweigh in terms of my overall compensation. Let me maybe overweigh taking my compensation from my corporation in the form of salary, just so I can create some of this tax deferred room. Now for that's obviously something that's done in working with an accountant and with a financial planner as well to see how that affects the entire plan. But for sure, that's something that can be done where somebody will come and say, you know what, historically I haven't paid myself a salary, but now I'm going to start to do that. And so we set up an individual pension plan. Even though they haven't paid themselves a historical salary, the fact that they're going to have a salary going forward, that would then create that additional contribution room for them to take advantage of, again, above and beyond what they might have been able to take advantage of in their RSPs.
Okay. Before we jump into the topic of setting it up and like how to manage it, I just want to cover two things with you or ask you about not only the advantages on the tax side, but also on the legal side. So how would an IPP be beneficial on the legal side for an individual business owner versus putting money into, their RRSP?
Yeah, for sure. You know what? I am looking forward to touching on in terms of the tax benefits. Now, one thing maybe I can mention before I really directly answer your question is, and I've said this in passing several times in terms of, one is if somebody going forward is going to set up an individual pension plan for themselves, what they essentially do is Syria will say, well, because you're now taking advantage of something that's going to give you, I guess, of that tax deferred and tax sheltered contribution room to take advantage of compared to an RSP, they'll say, we're not going to allow you to do both. It's essentially, you're going to, quote unquote, give up being able to put money into an RSP so they can take advantage of something else that's going to give you much more contribution room than an RSP. The only caveat to that is if somebody has an IPP, they can still put in $600 per year into the RSP. But again, they get much more contribution in an IPP. Now, in terms of the legal benefits you mentioned, it's one of the benefits is an IPP comes with very strong creditor protection. Your listeners might be aware that in Canada, one of the things is pension assets are sort of, treated very sacredly, if you will. If a corporation is going to go under or go bankrupt, really the assets in a pension plan are off the table from creditors. And so we do see IPPs come with very strong creditor protection. I'd argue that RSPs do have pretty strong credit protection as well, maybe except for more recent contributions. But the benefit of the IPP is because you can put so much more money into it, somebody can then credit to protect much more of the retirement assets. The only caveat there is we don't see this come often, but if somebody comes to GBL to set up an IPP and they know that they're about to get sued, and they're trying to do it just to avoid the credit protection, we wouldn't sign off on that. No, there'll be ruling saying you can't do it for that specific reason. But if it's just a bona fide retirement planning strategy, then you do get the strong credit protection.
Okay. And then you mentioned a key point here about keeping, having more room in your IPP, but also you can still have an RRSP, but of course your room will be drastically limited because of how pensions are basically reducing your contribution room personally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point as well. Okay, so let's go through this scenario where you have this client, they're 40 years old. Let's assume that they've accumulated, let's say roughly $500,000 in their RRSP, a corporate, like their corporation, then they have surpluses there. They've always maxed out or, paid themselves the maximum salary that were possible to create that RRSP room. Over the last 15 to 20 years, the first step would be to see how is the IPP more beneficial. And as you mentioned, at that cross age, instead of having, let's say, $32,000 of contribution room, then they might get a bit over that. And then as they continue to age, that room will continue to grow and grow higher or be higher than the RRSP equivalent. So for them, let's say they look at this and they're like, okay, I really like this approach. I'm going to be able to have greater tax savings through my IPP than I would be doing through my current RRSP or, salary and RRSP contribution. So what is the first step? Let's say from someone like myself, I would open an IPP account on my end, but then what? What are the first steps that someone needs to take to start implementing? And we'll go through all of them.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say the first step, even before getting to the point of opening the account, is the business owner working with their team to evaluate the value of this, right? In terms of, based on my situation, how old I am, how long I've been incorporated, the kind of salary I pay myself, how much of a benefit is this going to be, how much more contribution am I going to get, and is it worth it? Given the fees I might have to pay GBL or will have to pay GBL for the strategy. So what a lot of actuarial firms do, including ourselves, is we do a lot of complementary illustrations where it's a simple data collection form that we use to gather all the information we need: date of birth, salary history, some information about the RSPs, the value of them at any unused room. And then from that, we produce a quote or an illustration where on a go-forward basis, we're trying to compare, the status quo of using an RSP versus what's the advantage of then switching to an IPP specifically. So that's the first thing we do. And that at GBL, we'd have people such as myself to be able to help with those discussions. Typically at the table, the clients at the table, they got their financial planner there, perhaps their accountant as well, because this does touch, different facets of the affairs, just to have the discussion and then see whether it makes sense or not. So that'll be the first thing that'll sort of occur. In terms of if somebody, that's happened and the team has decided, this will be beneficial for the client, that's when GBL would be, given the go ahead to work to set this up. Well, again, we would gather all the information we need. GBL would then draft the documents required to set up this pension plan or this IPP and have it registered with the CRA. So this is where I suppose the value of GBL starts to really come in, because we're handling the drafting of the documents. No need maybe to involve a lawyer, because we have all these documents pre-drafted and available for clients to use. The client obviously signs off on everything, all the documentation, and then GBL would handle the submission to CRA for them to review and to register. Now, in terms of the process, typically what would happen is within 3 to 6 weeks, CRA would do an initial review of the documents, and then they would offer a sort of a first level registration. They call it deemed registration, where they give a registration number for this IPP. It's essentially them saying, we've received the application, everything looks to be in good order, so we're going to give you this deemed registration so you can start to do the work of actually opening up the investment account and getting ready to fund this thing. And then to your point, Guillaume, that's where you'd take on from there and start to open up the investment account and get ready to start to fund it. And I'm sure we're going to get more into one of the types of contributions you can make and one of the rough amounts. But generally, that's sort of the rough process in terms of how the setup works.
Awesome. Yeah. So first step is, of course, the application of this CRA, once everything is in order, and this is where you guys are helping. Now, once everything is in order and approved, this is where you turn over to the investment manager, financial planner. Then we open the account on our end. Then what happens to, well, two questions here. One is, okay, what's happening to their current RRSP, and what are the ways that they can fund that new IPP account going forward from their corporation?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the contribution, perhaps I'll talk about, there's about 3 ways that contribution is created to take advantage of. And the first one I'll talk about is something called past service. Now, for most business owners or incorporated professionals, when they set up an IPP, it's not right when they incorporated, right? As people are starting their practice, they're raising their families, they're trying to save a bit in their corporation, take care of insurances. There's a lot more to be done. And so typically by the time somebody gets to open up an IPP, they already have a history of being incorporated and a history of taking a salary. Now, the fact of the matter is, if somebody had maybe set up an IPP earlier in their career, above and beyond what they've already done in the RSPs, they would have been able to put away more than that, right? For the similar tax benefits where the money that goes in is tax deductible at source. So it's been funded on a pre-tax basis. As the money is like in an RSP and an IPP, the money is growing tax sheltered. And then you're getting that complete tax deferral all the way to the retirement years. And so if somebody had set up an IPP early on, they could have done what they've done and perhaps a lot more on top of that. So the first thing we do in our calculations is we'll calculate what's called past service funding. So the basic math of this, if I kind of really simplify it, is we're looking at each historical year, and our actuaries are doing the math of saying, well, if you had an IPP, how much more could you have put away into this plan? And they'll do the math and say, this is the differential, this is the delta. So we're allowed to create the contribution room to have you take advantage of it right away. So depending on the age and the history, this could be anywhere from $1,000 to multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the client details. Now, to get to your question specifically in terms of what happens with the existing RSP, CRA is very reasonable, and they'll say, look, if you want your corporation to take advantage of this increased contribution room in the IPP, you're going to have to, in a way, unlock it. Because the fact of the matter is, you paid yourself a salary and you got some sort of RSP benefit already. So what you're going to have to do is, from your RSP to this IPP, the actuary is going to do the calculation of how much of an RSP benefit did you get from your historical salary. They calculate what that value is, and then you transfer that money from your RSP account into the IPP. So it's a tax neutral event, right? There's no tax implications. The assets continue to be tax deferred and tax sheltered. But the mechanics is you move in what you're entitled to move into this IPP. Let's call it $50,000 or whatever it works out to be. But if you do that, then that's going to unlock this additional past service funding amount on top of that, which your corporation is then going to be able to put into the IPP. And again, they can claim the tax deduction and then benefit from the tax deferral as well. So that'll be my specific answer to that question about what happens initially with the RSPs.
Okay. There's a few things you covered here that I want to dive deeper. But one, when you look at the past service, so what you're saying is, if someone is, for example, 40, they would not really have a lot more room versus then, what they've maxed out in the RSP, right? Because the benefit is smaller. But then if someone is, let's say 50 or 55 or even maybe 60 years old, then there might be a lot more past service opportunities there where they could, already like initially fund it, and like that entire contribution, like you mentioned, let's say it's $300,000, that entire contribution can move from the corporation into the IPP, and it also becomes a tax deductible contribution, to the corporation. Is that correct?
Exactly. And especially what we see, it's, it can go a few ways, especially if somebody's maybe 40, 42. And in practice, most people aren't incorporated in their 20s, for example, right? So at that point, you might only have a few years of past service. But we do sometimes come across some clients who maybe they were incorporated in the early 30s. I just had one not too long ago, where it was a family business and receiving good salary from their late 20s as well. Where in situations like that, even at some of the earlier ages, you can get attractive enough past service room. Again, it might not be as much as $30,000, but that might be closer to the $40,000, $60,000, $70,000 mark. But to your point, that will be one of the things we evaluating those complementary illustrations, which is to say, based on your circumstances, is there any past service funding opportunity? And if so, what do the numbers look like?
Okay. And in practice, do you see usually where when someone sets up an IPP, depending on the age, of course, do you mostly see the entire RRSP being rolled over into the IPP? And then there's like an extra buffer there that they can contribute in that initial year? Or usually is it only a portion of the RRSP, and then they leave the rest of the RRSP kind of as is essentially, and they continue forward with the IPP? Like what is the most common way that you're seeing based on like past service and all the factors that are influencing?
So I'd say for most clients, it's not the entire RSP portion that's transferred in. So in many situations, again, it's a portion that moves into the IPP. So clients will end up in a situation where they have this IPP account, but they also have existing RSP assets that they have remaining. And that could be for multiple reasons. Some individuals might be paying themselves a salary from their business maybe before they incorporate. So, there's RSP contributions they've taken advantage of that can't be then utilized in the IPP as well. Or maybe they've had a salary from other sources as well before they start their business. So in a lot of cases, I'd say most cases, it's not the entire RSP that's being rolled in.
Perfect. So that makes sense. Just to recap what we covered so far, you guys helped or did the thorough analysis about the benefits, the applications with the CRA. Myself as a financial plan investment advisor, I've opened the account. We've ported over the amount that was established from the RSP, and then any top-up amount that were applicable in the situation. So now the client is set up going forward. So there's two questions I have for you going forward. So one is, can you talk about the amount that is determined that they can contribute on a yearly basis going forward? And then we'll talk about the investment after. But yeah, can you talk about this first? So now can you talk about this process of dictating how much will go into the IPP per year? And what is the process there?
Sure, definitely. So again, I find it very helpful in explaining an IPP to draw on any similarities we see on the RSP as well, just because these two things are sort of related and there's a lot of similarities. So like I mentioned earlier on, for something like an RSP, as somebody receives a salary, that salary creates contribution room in the RSP to be taken advantage of. As a similar type of mechanics in the IPP as well, where a business owner or a professional, they've set up this individual pension plan. And let's say in a subsequent year, they pay themselves a salary from a corporation or from their corporation. That salary in turn creates contribution room in the IPP for them to take advantage of. Now, the mechanics of how that would work is, unlike an RSP where the contribution is made personally from personal money or personal funds, that this contribution would come directly from the corporation, and the corporation would get to claim the tax deduction on that. And then to your point earlier on is why people look into this sort of strategy is if somebody's in a case where they're in a situation where they could maximize an RSP, but they're also able to take advantage of more beyond that. For example, if somebody is age 45, in 2025 when we're recording this, they can get the $32,000 in the RSP. But in an IPP instead, they get about $39,000 of contribution room. So about a $6,000 advantage. And like we discussed earlier on, the older somebody gets, then the greater the advantage of the IPP, such that by the time somebody is 65, so let's suppose somebody is 65 this year, they still get the same $32,000 that they can put into an RSP if provided their T4 is at the maximum level. But then comparatively in an IPP, they can put up to $54,000. So about a $21,000 differential for just that 1 year. So that's where part of the benefit of the IPP really starts to come through, which is as somebody continually works and compensates themselves with salary from their corporation, for each year, they're able to cumulatively put more and more into this tax-deferred vehicle than they could with an RSP, which is part of the attraction in even considering this.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And then can we talk about the investment strategies? But also one thing I want to touch on about the investment is when you contribute to your IPP, then there's a few ways, there's a few strategies there that you can utilize to essentially influence how much you can actually top up your IPP as well in terms of contribution. But my first question is, what are the, I would say investments, but investment options, I would say, that are the most recommended there. And do you recommend, altering this to maximize the top up? And what I'm referring to here is basically heavily weighting, let's say, an IPP invested in like fixed income in order to have returns that are lower than the actual contribution, which would be, around like, was it 7% or the target return that, and then you would look, you would make appear that your IPP is basically underfunded, and then you'll be able to top that up. Can you talk about like the investment strategies around the IPP, I guess from your perspective and your expertise and what you're seeing now?
Happy to do that. And one of the things that I've mentioned about an individual pension plan is that there does need to be an actuary who's going to essentially value this plan, right? As in terms of the business owner has set up this, again, to find benefit for themselves. And we talked about that 2% rule where the pension is going to be 2% of your cumulative salary. And so the question becomes, well, if this is the pension that the IPP is supposed to pay me in retirement, well, how much do I need to fund each year? And so that's when an actuary comes in with their expertise, and then they do sort of the nerdy math, I guess. And one of the things that they actually have to assume is they have to assume that the assets are going to grow at 7.5% per year. Now, this isn't necessarily a mandated return that needs to be hit, but it is something that comes from the CRA, and they say that as an actuary doing their math, that's the sort of anticipated growth in the invested assets. So what happens is if the average return, and this is evaluated every 3 years, but if in a 3-year period, the average return of what's actually being put into the IPP is below that 7.5%, when an actuary does their checkup every 3 years, they kind of take a look to see, this is how much we should ideally have in the IPP. And then they'll look to see, well, what's the actual returns been in terms of what's the asset base. So if there's a gap in terms of based on those assumptions that they use, the assets could have been more, then that creates additional contribution for a client to actually put in more money to sort of backstop and bump up the assets to where they technically, quote unquote, maybe need to be. So that's often referred to as a top up. And again, so that's additional money a client can put in for the same tax benefits. They can still write it off. It's still tax deductible. And so that goes to your point in terms of a common strategy we see is, a client has a portfolio that's spread across multiple accounts, right? You've got your RSPs, TFSAs, non-registered corporate accounts, or what have you. Sometimes what we see is the more lower volatile assets, the more fixed income, those are more primarily put into an IPP. And it's with this 7.5% sort of rule in mind, right? Where the idea is, well, we're going to put our fixed stuff into the IPP. We're expecting that the average return is going to be lower than that 7.5%. And so come the next 3 evaluation, we might have some additional top-up room for us to be able to put more money from our corporation into this IPP. And so for people who are mostly focused on just trying to manage their corporate assets as tax efficiently as possible, or build their retirement as tax efficient as possible, that's something we typically see just so that they can really maximize sort of their tax deductibility and their tax deferral along the way.
Yeah, no, that's a great asset location decision. I mean, I would probably argue that and that's where financial planning is so important, and we see that all the time, I would probably argue that you would have to probably balance, what is the trade-off between, let's investing your IPP in 100% equities, globally diversified portfolio, or maybe an 80-20, and then growing that over the next, let's say 20 years, if you're 40 and you want to retire at 60 or 65. I mean, I would probably want to evaluate what is that versus, let's say, heavily weighting, a portfolio in fixed income in order to get, a top up within a 3-year period, and then, have a tax savings there. So I always say, never supersede investment with tax decisions. Like always, start with your goals, starts with, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? You're trying to maximize your wealth, by the time you retire. Okay, let's work backwards. What will get you there? And then let's try to make it more tax, as tax efficient as possible. But what you're saying, which I think is a great point, is if you have a, let's say 60-40 or 80-20 kind of overall family portfolio, well, if there's one place that you could actually put fixed income, it would highly be recommended to probably put into the IPP because of that ability to top up your IPP when there's a spread between like the required rate of return of 7.5 and the actual return of, or the growth of that IPP. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, exactly. Guillaume, you really hit it. And maybe a couple of things I can add to that if I can. And that's why we stress at GBL, we stress it's when a client is looking at this, they should involve their financial planner and then they should involve their accountant as well in their decision, right? Because it's not uncommon for something to come across my desk and I sort of make the recommendation that I'm not sure that this is a good fit for this client, right? As well, we're certainly not the type of firm to run around saying every business owner should have an IPP. There can be lots of reasons why either the timing doesn't work or it's just not a good fit. I'm sure we're going to touch on that a little bit later on as well. But it's certainly not everybody who should have one. And maybe the last comment I'll make as well is with regards to the 7.5%, there may be somewhat of a misconception in the industry. It can be up to 7.5%, but you can imagine as actuaries, when they do their evaluation, there's other assumptions that they have to utilize as well. Again, mandated from CRA. So depending on how everything shakes out, it's not necessarily up to 7.5% in every year. So it's actually a bit of a moving target that you see. So we've seen some years where that break-even point is not, sometimes it's very close to the 7.5%, but it sometimes might be a little lower, maybe 6%, 5.75%. So it kind of depends on how all the assumptions that actually has to make, how everything is shaken up with actual experience as well.
Can you talk about what happens if, for example, 1 year, the stipulated contribution from the business owner is, for example, 70,000. That's what's supposed to be into the IPP, but the business owner, for whatever reason, can't make it. Or let's say when you get to the 3-year mark, and I want to touch on this as far as like the admin stuff and the maintenance of an IPP, but let's say when you get to that renewal mark or evaluation date where the IPP is underfunded, for example, what happens there and what are the consequences if there's any?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Early on in our podcast, when I was talking about who's a good fit, I made sure to mention that you're typically looking at somebody who's quote unquote a connected employee, right? So you're looking at a business owner or professional who owns at least 10% of the corporation that's setting this up. And the key reason for that is when it comes to sort of the enforced funding rules that you're sort of getting at, those fall under provincial jurisdiction. And what most provinces have done is they've said, if you're going to do an IPP for this type of individual who's connected, we're not going to force you to fund the required amount every year. Now, we might argue and say, well, if somebody's going to do an IPP, I suppose there should be somebody who intends to maximize it or to be able to take advantage of the contribution room. But the good thing is, or the nice thing is, if it's in a particular year where maybe we generate $70,000 of contribution room, but maybe the client has a bad year, or maybe they want to use their cash flow to do more things within the business, they do have the flexibility to say, you know what, I'm not going to take advantage of that $70,000 this year. Maybe I'm going to carry it forward and take advantage of it next year or the year after that. So they do have that flexibility. The only two provinces that still enforce some minimum funding rules for even these types of sort of owner managers would be Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. Saskatchewan is actually in the process of changing their legislation, and they say they think by the end of 2025, they'll make it flexible as well. But for the most part, all the other provinces, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, a lot of the eastern provinces, they have implemented that flexibility. But we're even, to your point, when we do that valuation every 3 years, and we say, you know what, there's additional top-up room that can be taken advantage of. To the client, it's an option. Is, if it makes sense, if you want to, you can maximize this, but there's nobody that's going to force you to do it, even if, especially if you're not maybe having a good year. It's up to you and your tax planning based on what makes sense.
Okay. What are the administrative requirements that a business owner needs to be on top of, or I guess depending on if they're working, I guess, with GBL and like their planners, like what are the requirements that are required, to be able to be on the right side of the CRA?
Right.
Throughout the maintenance of that IPP.
Right. Great point. So in terms of these strategies, it is a lot of administrative work in terms of the filings. There's certain trust returns that need to be submitted and specialized CRA forms that need to be prepared and filed on an annual basis. And so it is something that adds to the complexity. And that's why companies like GBL exist, where typically for a lot of the larger institutions or accounting firms, there isn't really the expertise to do this sort of specialized filings. And so that's part of our service where we are taking on sort of the administrative, I guess, headache or the burden of that and carrying it on behalf of the client and their team. we'll do it typically. The way we work is at the beginning of each year, we reach out to the investment advisor and just ask for a summary of what happened with the IPP over the last calendar year. And then once we have that, then we prepare the filings and we actually send it directly to the CRA following that. And then at the end of the day, we just send a note to the advisor and the client saying, we got the information, it's been submitted to the CRA and it's done.
Okay. What are the disadvantages, or who should not be implementing or even look at an IPP?
Right. You know what? I love this question. And honestly, I think it's just as important as talking about who it does work for. So I think to the first point, if somebody's going to take advantage of an IPP, there is obviously the administrative and compliance annual work that needs to be done, as well as the valuation reports the actuary has to do every 3 years. So with that, typically there's a partner like GBR that needs to be brought into the mix. And then obviously that incurs a fee. I'd say most actuarial firms, they charge between a base fee of between $1,500 and $2,000 a year is kind of where the range is. And so the first thing that needs to be done is, based on the business owner and how much of a salary they're paying themselves, you need to weigh that fee against the benefit or the additional tax deductible contribution room that somebody's going to get. And that needs to make sense, right? It's just a simple cost benefit analysis. So for a lot of people it does, but for some people it doesn't. Maybe it's just a lower T4 salary. So in a case like that, then the decision might be, it doesn't make sense for us to pay this fee just to get a few extra $100 just because this person is super young, or they just don't T4 themselves enough. So I'd say that's a primary consideration. The second thing I'd say somebody should, or what their team should consider as well is, once money goes into an IPP, it's a registered asset, but it's specifically, it's a locked-in retirement asset, right? So what that means is, we talked about, the sort of this pension promise that's in the IPP, that 2% rule we've mentioned a couple of times. And so what happens is in the retirement years, if the business owner decides to draw down directly from the IPP assets, whatever the pension amount is calculated to be based on that 2%, let's say it's $50,000 a year, what have you, that's the amount they can take out on a yearly basis. It's not like other accounts where maybe there's a minimum threshold and a maximum threshold, and you can sort of move around in between. It's more of a fixed amount. So the planning needs to be done in terms of, if we are restricted to this annual amount on a yearly basis, how well does it work with the overall plan, based on what their consumption needs are, how much they have maybe saved in a corporate account or TFSA, RSP. Is this not a problem? Do we need more flexible access to these assets in retirement? So that just becomes a consideration in terms of some of the modeling I know you would do to see whether or not that this makes sense going forward. So I would say it really kind of comes down to mainly those two things, which is the fee justified for this client, and is the fact that these assets are locked in, is that you have all these tax benefits that are beneficial. That's fantastic. But in terms of how much we can withdraw with this, are there any potential issues around that which might affect whether it's a yes or no decision?
Yeah. So cost, administrating this IPP, stability in business income, and flexibility in accessing the funds are essentially kind of key things to consider for someone to even this, before even exploring this solution. Last question I have for you is, at the end, one of the last questions, fast forward to, client is at retirement. So they've done all the work of, as far as setting it up when they were at the right age. Everything made sense for them. They were meeting the criteria. It was well suited. It was well, they used that, all the benefits throughout the career. Now they're turning 65. It's time to retire. And just let's assume in this scenario that, they are, let's say, either selling the business or winding it down, depending if there's a resale value and whatnot. Like, what happens to the IPP and what are the options for someone who is at that stage?
Right. So there's essentially three options for how somebody can draw down. Perhaps the first option I'll mention is, and this will particularly apply if somebody's in a case where they're selling their business or they're winding up their corporation for any reason. Well, what we do typically, what somebody would look at is to wind up the IPP as well, or we say to commute it. Because an IPP is a pension plan that is effectively sponsored by the business owner's corporation, if their corporation is sold to a third party or is wound up, then there's no longer I suppose, a corporation for that IPP to be attached to, right? Or if you're selling the business, any third-party owner who buys a business, they're not going to want an IPP anywhere close to their books, right? So in the case like that, there typically be two options. One is the business owner could look at collapsing the plan into a LIRA or a LIF, so a locked-in RSP or a locked-in RIF. What they actually would do is, following CRA rules, we would calculate what's the maximum threshold that can be moved based on your age and your income history. What's the maximum that can be moved from this IPP to this LIRA or to the LIF account? If all the IPP assets are below that maximum threshold, then fantastic. Everything goes over tax deferred. And then from then on, it would just be the typical rules that apply to LIRAs and LIFs. If we do come across situations where the IPP assets are above that maximum threshold, and so in a case like that, we'd still move over the maximum that we can to this locked-in account. But if there's anything that's left over above and beyond that, then that will be paid directly to the client as a taxable lump sum. So typically we don't see this amount being too large. It kind of depends on the investment returns. So typically, doing your fantastic job as a financial planner, that's where the planning will be done, where maybe that taxable portion is used to fund personal consumption in the years paid out, and then other income sources are deferred, or planning is done around that. Now, another option we do see is drawing down the pension. So it's essentially treating the pension plan, I suppose, the way it was designed to be treated, where if somebody's corporation is going to remain registered, or the business is going to continue in their ownership, but then somebody can pay themselves an annual pension from the IPP. So again, we would do the calculation to say, based on your salary, this is what your annual pension is. And then that's the amount that will be paid out of the IPP account to the individual. So the assets remain tax sheltered in the IPP account. And then on an annual or monthly basis, it just pays out sort of the prescribed pension that the individual is entitled to. The last option somebody would have is they could use the assets in the IPP account to go to a life insurance company and essentially purchase a lifetime annuity from an insurance company. It's something we very rarely see taken advantage of for different reasons, but it is an option. Somebody, perhaps if they're just very concerned about the longevity risk, and they just want the money to last as long as it possibly can, then that's something else somebody can look into.
Okay, so porting it to a LIRA, or buying an annuity, or leaving it into actually the IPP itself and then accumulating it throughout their retirement. Yes. But if you leave it in with the corp and the IPP, then again you still have, let's say, the 2,000, 1,500 to 2,000 of admin fee like on your end and all that stuff, right? So this is probably that part to consider as well. Do you want to decumulate it that way and maintain the kind of same setup that you had while you were growing it, or does it make more sense to actually port it? Ideally would be you would port it entirely to your LIRA account, locked in investment retirement account, and then manage it that way. Or like you mentioned, but you see rarely, is you would purchase an annuity, and then you would have a guaranteed source of income essentially from that annuity throughout your retirement. So
exactly, and that's often our recommendation, especially if somebody gets to the point where you've retired and you're realistically you're not going to put any more money into this plan. Oftentimes it makes sense to move it to port it to a LIRA, just because especially if there's no significant tax implications, because now you can port it over. You don't have to keep paying us an annual fee for something that you're not going to fund anymore. And so it's not uncommon for us to kind of come out and just say that recommendation and say, hey, you should really consider this. It has benefited you well over the years, but maybe now it's time to move over and save yourself some fees going forward.
Makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Do you have any last piece of advice to someone who's listening, who's a business owner, who may be looking to explore a solution like this because they're probably already maxing out their RSP and they're incorporated and have surplus cash and they're looking for greater tax savings for their retirement?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say the first thing I would say is, it doesn't hurt to take a look. Like I say, most actuarial firms like GBL, they will prepare a complimentary illustration for you. Even if somebody's young, was early 40s or even before that, oftentimes it can be just very helpful to have this looked at and run it by the financial planner and accountant and sort of have their pre-planning being done. Oftentimes, it might be, it doesn't make sense now, but maybe, maybe 5-6 years from now, it'll be great. So maybe let's look at how you're paying yourself. Maybe let's pay you more salary or what have you. right? It's not going to cost money to look at that. It will cost some time and effort, obviously. But we say, it's no harm, no foul to sort of look. We're not going to push people to do something that doesn't make sense. We'll kind of give the information, offer the expertise, but then allow the client and the advisory team to look at this and make the best decision possible.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's the way to go. That's also how we approach everything around financial planning and sharing financial planning advice with the clients, as far as adopting a calibrator approach and evaluating different scenarios to make sure that what we put forward is objective and it's in their best interest and it's best suited for them with the highest likelihood of implementing the strategy, which is key. Whether you're talking, I think, of an IPP or any other financial planning solutions out there, is, how well do you understand it? Are you highly likely to implement it and stick to it throughout your career? Because those are big decisions to make and implement. So making sure it's the right fit from the get-go and it's something that will really benefit you long-term are, of course, essential to ensure before moving forward.
Sure.
So Tatenda, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I saw that, or at least, I'll put the link in the show note, but, clients can find more at gblinc.ca. And of course, you can always reach out to us at nwadvisors.ca. If you have any questions, you want to book a meeting, subscribe to our newsletters, and all the links will be in the show notes. Don't forget to follow us on social. And with that, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Awesome. Thank you, Guillaume. It was a pleasure.